about how the semester's going, and particularly a lot of comments about last week's class on education. Believe it or not, counting tonight, there are only 5 classes left and we're at the end of the semester. Next week, we're going to be looking at the whole question of urban public finance. And we'll be joined by Jay Ash, the city manager of the City of Chelsea, and Mike Widmer from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. Really looking at, public finance in an era in which there is no money. The cuts are so dramatic. We're going to follow that up by actually picking up on a theme that we began last week, which is the role of public employee unions. And we'll have the president of the Massachusetts American Federation of Teachers joining us for that conversation, as well as Richard Bob McKersey from MIT, an expert on labor management relations, and I'll also be adding my 2 cents, since I've actually written about this. And then we're going to follow that up with the one that I'm all excited about as well, and that is the role of the big city newspaper. Renee Loth, former editor of the editorial page of the Boston Globe, Adrian Walker, one of the top journalists of the Globe, Bob Kuttner from American Prospect, and our special guest, Dan Okrent, former associate editor of Time Magazine and the first ombudsman of the New York Times. And then finally, we will close the semester with the role of anchor institutions in cities. And we'll have the new mayor of the city of Boston, serving his 5th term, Paul Guzzi, president of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and Joseph Aoun, the president of Northeastern University and my boss. So he'll have a chance to meet you and you'll have a chance to meet him. But this evening, we have really another absolutely extraordinary seminar, lecture, with 2 dear friends, the police commissioner for the city of Boston, Ed Davis, who actually is one of the few people who is returning for a second engagement with the Open Classroom, having taught in the first Open Classroom that Paul and I ran in the spring of '08. His presentation was so mesmerizing that we had to have him back. And our dear friend Robert Lewis Jr., Vice President of the Boston Foundation, who I think you will find equally fascinating. So lots more to do, but believe it or not, we are almost 2/3 through the semester, and it seems like it just started yesterday. Paul Grogan.
Barry.
Thank you very much, Barry, and welcome all. It's again my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers this evening. I want to make a few introductory comments. Tonight we're exploring the prospects for public safety in Boston and in our nation's cities. And within our lifetime, certainly, this issue has received an enormous amount of attention, usually in a very negative way. We talked early in the course about the urban crisis that developed after World War II as people fled to the suburbs. It was widespread abandonment and blight in neighborhoods, heavy concentrations of poverty, just the kind of conditions that experts believe give rise to high crime, and indeed that is what occurred in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in our major cities. And just as there was great pessimism about the future of cities in those days, I think it's fair to say that the conventional wisdom was that big cities would just have to live permanently with very high crime rates because the conditions that were generating that crime were going to continue, and if we were going to make progress in cities, we were just going to have to accept this kind of permanent crime wave that was being generated. But then came the 1990s, and with the 90s, astonishing reductions in crime that occurred first in Boston and New York. Breathtaking success in reducing crime that had thought to, that we thought was going to be unalterable. And they were soon joined by other cities And the mid-90s was a period when people were celebrating the rather unexpected and implausible reductions in crime that was occurring. And in both cities, there were very distinctive things being done, very different things that had been done before in terms of policing and also in terms of relations with the community. And the Bostonians figured very prominently in both cities because the first police commissioner under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani in New York in the 90s, when so much of New York's crime reduction occurred, was Bill Bratton, a native Bostonian and former superintendent of police in Boston. The head of the subway system in New York, where a lot of the crime was occurring and where spectacular crime reductions occurred, is a fellow named Bob Kiley, who was Bostonian as well and ran our own MBTA before going to New York to run the transit system. There are quite distinctive things in each city, and I'll mention a couple of things briefly. Bratton pioneered a new philosophy of policing that emanated from something called the broken windows theory, which some of you may be familiar with. The broken windows theory emanates from a social science experiment that was carried out by a Stanford University professor in the late 60s. And it was an attempt to create a relationship, or to understand the relationship between disorder in an urban environment and crime. And the particular experiment consisted of parking two cars and leaving them on the street for extended periods of time in low-income neighborhoods in a city in California. And one car they deliberately roughed up, broke some of the windows, smashed in a fender or two, and the other car was left intact. And the result of this experiment was that the car that was deliberately damaged was destroyed very, very quickly. And the car that was left intact was left intact. Nothing happened to it. And just to confirm the experiment, they then went ahead and broke a window or two in the car that was left intact in the first round, and that car too was dismantled and destroyed. An Atlantic magazine article called Broken Windows in 1982, which was written by a fellow named George Kelling and the famous social scientist James Q. Wilson, who I believe is now deceased, drew out some of the implications of this broken windows theory. And one of their theories was that there was an organic generative relationship between urban disorder of the kind that was so pervasive in big cities at that time, neighborhoods strewn with trash, abandoned buildings, weed-filled empty lots. That there was a very direct relationship between those environments and crime. If you could clean up those environments, you might have a great deal of success in curbing crime. And this was the birth of something called order policing, which Bill Bratton was a devotee of George Kelly, one of the authors, and he implemented a whole policing strategy based on that. First in the New York transit system, and then as a commissioner of police in New York. And for those of you who were in New York in the mid to late 80s, you may recall the condition of the subway system. It was a frightening experience to ride the New York subways in those days. Every car was covered with graffiti. When you went into a station, there were all sorts of young men called fare beaters jumping the turnstiles and running into the subway. There were homeless camps, cardboard villages in many of the stations. The whole atmosphere of the subways was menacing. And of course, in fact, crime was very high. The previous philosophy had been to not worry about these nuisance crimes like fare beating and things like that, and to devote police resources to going after the serious criminals. Bratton turned that on its head. He decided that they would go after the small things, because it was those accumulation of small things, nuisance crimes, that were creating this sense of menace and depressing ridership in the New York subway. So while his boss, Bob Kiley, cleaned all the graffiti, they established a system for taking the graffiti off the cars every night, and eventually that created a graffiti-free subway system. they started posting detectives at the turnstiles and systematically arresting these young men who were jumping the turnstiles and going into the stations without pay. This had a remarkable effect on the New York subways, and I happen to be a resident of New York City in those days. I mean, what seemed like overnight, the subways became a kind of a habitable, inviting place, and that sense of menace receded, and ridership began to grow. But in addition to that, despite the fact that the people being arrested were at the outset guilty of only minor crimes, what Bratton discovered was a very large fraction of these folks were wanted for more serious crimes, were out on warrants. And so there was this harvest of arrests in the subway. And crime in the New York subways literally fell off a cliff. They reduced crime within a very short space of time by 75% in the New York subways. It was a revolution, and it was a revolution by turning conventional wisdom on its head. And then he went on to apply that border policing theory more broadly as Commissioner of the City of New York, and enjoyed during his very brief tenure. New York executed a 60% reduction in homicides over a 3 or 4 year period in the mid-90s, and over a 50% reduction in overall crime. In addition to order policing, Bratton brought several other dimensions. One was the devolving real authority and accountability to the precincts, and holding precinct captains accountable for reductions in crime with a kind of a no excuses approach. And this was backed up by an information system which has become very famous, called ComStat, which provided real-time information for these accountability sessions and allowed the rapid focus of police resources on troubled areas in the city. Underlying all this was a truly revolutionary notion, though, again, that stood the conventional wisdom on its head, which was that police could reduce crime. The previous view was all police can do is kind of contain crime, because crime is coming out of these root causes, these socioeconomic conditions, and until you alleviate those conditions, you're going to have high crime. There's just no way around it. Bratton didn't accept that. And he established this principle that they were going to make a difference, that policing was all about actually solving the problem as opposed to merely containing it. So it's really a very, very interesting period in policing, and of course Bratton went on to an equally successful tenure as Chief of Police in Los Angeles, from which he has just retired. I'm not going to tell as much of the Boston story, which is equally interesting, because I think we're going to hear about that from our two speakers. But Boston matched New York in just stunning crime reductions in the 90s. And so there were some unique Boston dimensions, including a remarkable partnership between the black clergy in the inner city and the Boston Police Department, unprecedented cooperation among all parts of the criminal justice system that allowed a kind of focus that had not been there before. The deployment of street workers, highly trained street workers that could intervene in the cycle of youth and gang violence that was occurring, and so forth. The question going forward is, what do we think of these reforms now? Are they capable of bringing us again the remarkable crime reductions of the 90s? Are those crime reductions sustainable? What are the new issues that have appeared in more recent times, and so forth? And to help us explore these very interesting questions, we have the Police Commissioner of the City of Boston, Ed Davis, and the Vice President for Programs at the Boston Foundation, Robert Lewis. Ed Davis is the 40th Police Commissioner of the City of Boston. And of course, we have, I hope we all know, the oldest municipal police department in the United States. He was sworn in by Mayor Menino on December 4th, 2006. Before becoming our commissioner, he was a 28-year veteran of the Lowell Police Department, culminating in serving as superintendent for the last 12 years. He rose through the ranks, holding a variety of positions, including captain in charge of community policing and commander of a combined federal, state, local narcotics and organized crime unit. He was also a founding member of the Massachusetts Major City Chiefs Association. Robert Lewis is at the Boston Foundation, but has had a long career in this city in public service in both city government and the nonprofit community. He has been executive director of BCCJ, the Boston Centers for Youth and Families, Boston Centers for Community and Justice, rather, a leading nonprofit that operates the Lead Boston Executive Leadership Program, directed the Boston Centers for Youth and Families for Mayor Menino. His background as a community organizer, and as I'm sure he will discuss, organized the street worker program that was such a vital component of the crime reduction successes of the 90s. What's at stake here in this issue, of course, is not merely safety and the reduction of crime. It is the relationship of that to the broader prospects for revitalizing cities. And of course, one of the things that happened during this period of remarkable crime reduction in Boston, New York, and other cities is an explosion of commerce in low-income neighborhoods. We saw tremendous job growth, the return of vital commercial facilities like supermarkets and pharmacies. So there's a very direct relationship between this issue and many others that we've been discussing in this course. So it's my pleasure now to kick things off by inviting the Police Commissioner of Boston, Ed Davis, to the podium. Thank you.